College football nerds here talking Indiana and Notre Dame. It is an interesting matchup in the cold that we are going to get nerdy with, y'all. I got Josh here. We're going to talk about this game. Not only are we going to talk about the matchups, and we're going to talk about the interesting numbers. We've got a model that's been really successful this year. It's been successful the last few years. And Josh, there's somebody that tracks all the models, like all the ESPN models, FPI, all this. And weighted against the spread, which includes the early spread, the midweek spread, and the end of the week spread, we're like number one in the country. So it's just worth just putting that out there for all the people that say burn your model. They need to understand that if you have a model that hits 53% of the time, that is actually really good because Vegas doesn't lose. All right, Josh, the interesting discussion point I want to start off with this in this game is I firmly believe both of these teams are solidly playoff deserving teams. And the reason I have to give this caveat is because people like to pick apart teams that they don't like or teams that they want to exclude in favor of some other team. So they're going to point at Notre Dame's loss to NIU. They're going to point at Indiana's lack of playing ranked teams. But Josh, I want you to talk a little bit about one of the most important things we've tracked since we started this thing a long time ago is elite teams show the ability to go on a run and win games comfortably. And I think that is a bigger sort of insight into whether or not you belong in the playoffs, especially a 12-team playoff, versus whether or not you had a one-time slip-up game where you didn't look great or you didn't play your best. Josh, these two teams have just clubbed people over the head for most of their schedule. Talk a little bit about how that is a good sign for both these teams in terms of at least deserving to be in the field.
I think both these teams, because of an unfortunate loss or a loss in their one big game, have kind of flown under the radar. When you look at their week-to-week performance, they've been two of the more consistent, ironically, in view of that, right? And we've talked a lot in these previews to say the difference between ranking a team based on their wins and losses and projecting them for future performance, which is based on power ratings. And I really don't even care what your record is. Your record does not win you future games. We could have a much longer rant on a different aspect of that, which is I think we should rank teams based not on the rankings of who they beat, but based on the power ratings of who they beat. For the same reason, having a high ranking from an easy schedule or for winning lucky games, or a low ranking because you lost a stupid game even though you're really good, does not make you easy or hard to beat. But that aside, there's no question the Northern Illinois game was a stupid slip-up by Notre Dame, coming off an A&M win by 10 points against a pretty good A&M team in a schedule where they basically blew everybody else out. Indiana clubbed basically their entire schedule except for Ohio State. One close game against Michigan as well. And so it gets kind of hard to fully evaluate, who these teams are in view of that, because I think it's colored so much by the one negative or the one good team they played. Now, I will say, Daniel, in regard to all this, I don't know that enough is said that Indiana, for all the criticism of their schedule, and I'm just going to say this, Notre Dame fans, and you're all going to get mad at me, but, I got to say it. Notre Dame's is probably worse in a lot of ways. And this comes a lot down to the way in which you do strength of schedule rankings. But I'm looking right now, strength of schedule total for Notre Dame is currently 60th. And Indiana's 67th, which isn't much better, if better at all, right? It's worse. But the difference is Indiana actually had to play Ohio State, and they played Michigan. Notre Dame, their best game is still probably Texas A&M, maybe USC. They won Texas A&M close. They beat USC close. So I agree with you that clubbing people away is important, but that's 10 points at Texas A&M, 14 points at USC. Indiana, when you look at their away games, at UCLA is a joke. At Northwestern this year is a joke. At Michigan State this year is a joke. The only other one they played was Ohio State, and they lost by 23. And so I agree with you, and I agree with the fact that they club teams, but what makes this game so annoyingly difficult to project is the fact that the schedules were so lopsided. And look, to be clear, these are two teams that play name schedules, right? They play 9 conference game in the Big Ten. You can't hope who you were scheduled to be. I blame the Big Ten leadership for just assuming Washington and Michigan would reload when they were balancing schedules. They didn't. It made Indiana's schedule really weak. Not their fault. I do fault Indiana, I will say, for playing Florida International, Western Illinois, and Charlotte out of conference. And yes, that is a Big Ten team with no Power 5 team out of conference playing in FCS, which doesn't get enough shred. But Notre Dame, it's an all-name schedule. They like. I mean, what do you want them to do? You play USC, you play Florida State, you play Texas A&M as your out of conference game. You have your tie-ins with the ACC, Georgia Tech. So many of those teams are just terrible. But it does create a challenge because, for example, FEI, right? Notre Dame for an elite team strength of schedule 46, Indiana's 42nd. Again, reflecting the fact Indiana may be a little harder for elite team is really the measure for how difficult a schedule is for making a playoff. Long story short. You can go to bcftoys.com to follow FEI and their ratings. A great follow with Brian Fremeau. It's hard. And so I agree with you, Daniel, that they've been great away. In typical fashion, I've made it a negative. But I think that's the challenge because I do think in so many of their games where we talk about a lot, beating up on bad and mediocre teams shows you're a good team. And when they've played mediocre competition, these two teams have killed them, with really that one exception of the Northern Illinois game, which just seems to be Freeman's annual or biannual drop the absolutely mind-numbingly, bafflingly game. The rest of the way, they've been maybe the most dominant team in the entire country of a year where nobody can play consistently. These teams have beaten bad opponents badly on a consistent basis to the extent that no one else has. So how do you square that away with the schedules that are so lopsided? I don't know. And it makes this, to me, some of the more maybe the most fascinating game, and I think the hardest one to project.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to project, and Vegas has got this kind of a comfortable win, at least in terms of what you would expect to see in all of these games, like a touchdown plus, which is really interesting to me, because you wouldn't think if you said that in August that the 12-team playoff in the first round, which eliminates the top four teams, by the way, is an indictment on how we seed those top four teams. What you end up with unfairly is instead of somebody playing Arizona State, like I think that, Indiana might be playing, one of these teams will be playing Arizona State instead of each other. I think it's a little bit interesting, but yeah, Josh, I don't know how you comfortably, predict this game other than the fact that it is a road game for Indiana in a year where Indiana didn't play, like they played at Ohio State, got clobbered, and then all their other away games were Michigan State, Northwestern, UCLA. Like they haven't played a tough road game, especially a night game at Notre Dame. Like that's a tough thing to walk into. But I just wonder, and I want to touch on just, you said Notre Dame's schedule might have been weaker than Indiana's. I think it is fair, and you touched on it at the very end. We always give this caveat with Notre Dame. There is a difference between playing a weak schedule and trying to play a good schedule. Notre Dame always tries to play a good schedule. When you schedule Texas A&M on the road, like a home and home, and they do that too, they don't do a ton of neutral site stuff. You schedule Florida State. You schedule, like Louisville was a pretty good team this year. They're trying. They play USC every year. It's not their fault that USC sucks. They can't help that, right? But in this, there are a couple of like kernels of concern. Namely, Notre Dame got kind of a boost based on killing Navy, who was ranked at the time, and then killing Army, who was ranked at the time. Those two teams are not good football teams. They are just teams who offensively can give other teams fits because they don't prepare for a triple option, right? I think 31-13 over Georgia Tech is a good result. I wonder, though, in terms of what gave Indiana fits, right, when they played Ohio State, does Notre Dame present the same sort of team? Because then we get into matchups and maybe get into model. I think the Ohio State game was a little bit artificially lopsided because of special teams gaffes and a struggling offense early on in that game. defensively, they didn't play poorly against Ohio State. Um, so one, maybe get into the model, and two, maybe talk about that, like how Notre Dame differs in terms of a matchup for Indiana versus.
And so we'll go ahead and get in the model on that just to sort of flush it out because I think it helps make the discussion, right? So if you run our model right now, it has Indiana 21, Notre Dame 20, basically 20.6 to 19.8. Yards per play, 5 to 4.8. Neither team throwing the ball well, 6.7 for Indiana, 5.6 for Notre Dame. 7.5 is the mark for competence. Indiana rushing for 3.8, which isn't good enough. 4.2 for Notre Dame, and again, 4 yards per carry is about the mark for competence. So this is a game where neither team can throw well. Notre Dame can sort of run it. Indiana can pass the ball just a little bit more effectively by a tiny margin. The interesting things I think with this are really looking at their statistical profiles because Indiana, I think their reputation has been a high-powered offensive team. According to our opponent-adjusted metrics, they're 12th in the country in passing offense and 49th in rushing. So a very average run game and a good but not really elite passing game, actually. Our model has the strength totally on defense, 13th against the pass, 5th against the run. It adjusts down from their overall ranks, if you note, which would be 6th and 3rd. Our metrics, I'm giving you opponent-adjusted metrics, and they're getting penalized because the opponents are bad overall. Notre Dame is very one-sided, which shouldn't surprise a lot of people. 61st best passing offense, the number one rushing offense in our model. They are second in passing defense per attempt. They are 28th in rushing defense per carry. The reality for all that is, I think this is a game where we're going to learn a lot about both teams because, in particular, Indiana is supposedly an underrated run defense. Again, and our opponent adjusted metrics, 5th in the country. Notre Dame's the number one rush offense. In theory, this should be the best run defense in Notre Dame's faced by a good margin. I don't know if that's true or not. Now, Daniel, we talked about in the preseason, prior years, during the season. I say preseason because we did an A&M preview, and we've taken heat for this for years. We are not high on Riley Leonard as a passer. We were not high on Riley Leonard as a passer. He had a really good game one time against Clemson. He did a lot of that with his legs. I think we're seeing a lot of the same issues. I think Notre Dame fans are, again, much like with the Nico discussion with Tennessee, hopefully some of you come around to the fact that we try to be honest, and a lot of times those honest takes that are unpopular, we are wrong sometimes, and sometimes we're idiots, but we are right more often than we're wrong. And Riley Leonard is a limited passer. He's limited in his accuracy. He's limited when he's put under pressure. And that limits Notre Dame, and everyone knows that. And they have to depend on the run, and that puts a ceiling on their offense. But, Daniel, the thing that I think flies under the radar in the Ohio State game is really the one time, Ohio State and Michigan, the two times I'll say, they played a good pass defense. And Michigan really wasn't fully healthy in the back end. But they're 7.4 yards per attempt, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception. It's not a great day with 206 yards passing. The Ohio State game, they completed 8 passes for 68 yards. They did nothing. And so when you look at the rest of the schedule, there's a 6.5 yard per attempt blip against Washington, which was kind of considered a test because Washington's defense was okay. And they passed the test 31-17. But did they? I mean, there's still a wart there. And so, Daniel, I think there's a real question with both these teams, and I think this is what you end up having to make a projection on. Does Notre Dame's run offense actually travel? I say travel, staying at home, but do they actually carry forward against an Indiana team that on paper is a really good run defense? And for Indiana, does their passing offense get shut down again versus a top-level pass defense, which Notre Dame has? And if that's the case, is this a really low-scoring game? Or is this the more high-scoring, functional, looks great sort of offensive game that everyone expects from Indiana and Notre Dame? And I want you to answer that question, and then I want you to also comment on the second part. To me, which version of those do you think reflects better on what these teams are in terms of how the winner is going to proceed in this playoff?
I think that this game is going to be ugly because these defenses are good, not because the offenses are bad. I think that Indiana got a little bit of a taste. And if I'm going to give one sort of knock on all of these teams that I do think belong in the playoffs, I also think there's this whole thing, this round robin thing that got missed in the Big Ten, where it's not just that you didn't play the elite teams, it's this dichotomy between you have really good teams in the Big Ten, and then the rest is pretty bad. And so Indiana having to prepare, didn't have to prepare week to week and play, like, they didn't have to play in a way consistently where they could have a bad game and lose. And so the Ohio State game represented that time where they prepared in a way, they played poorly, and they got blown out. Well, that could have happened a couple of times if they played good teams. We don't know. And that gets me to this thought of Boise, Penn State, Notre Dame, SMU, Indiana, and Texas. None of them have ranked wins. Like, that's a lot of teams in a playoff field to not have any ranked wins. There are guaranteed a couple of frauds in this group. Guaranteed. We just don't know who they are because there's so many teams that didn't play anybody that we don't know if they're good or bad. And we said this in the other video. We're going to say it now. Just because you don't play a tough schedule doesn't mean you're not an elite team. And so, Josh, I think in this game, it's going to be a defensive struggle, but I think it's going to be more because both these teams are going to have plenty of time to prepare for one another. I do wonder, though, you talked about, the warts on the Indiana offensive side. We've seen them for Notre Dame as well. I do wonder what to expect if these two teams defensively are as good as we think they are, and it's an ugly game. Like, do you just at that point, Josh, go with the home favorite? Like, because all things being equal, you think that the crowd can probably make them cause one turnover or a penalty in a tough situation. Like, is that kind of where you land?
I think so. I think so. I mean, it's there's so many question marks on this game. Love. We're both very high. We don't always name a lot of players in these videos, mostly for the sake of time. We both love Jeremiah Love. Kaiser is one of the best defenders in the country. Really, the whole Notre Dame defense is loaded. Indiana, I mean, Rourke is a good player. I think the receiving core is just all around really good. Sarah leads it, obviously, but I think the whole core is good, and really it's just a really balanced offense. But at the end of the day, playing at home, I think, for Notre Dame helps in a game that's lower scoring. Now, I think it's interesting. We were talking about, was it 47.5 for the Tennessee-Ohio State game? The over-under here is actually 50.5. It's actually expected to be higher scoring than that one. I think it says more about that game than this one. But I think, it really comes down to how much you trust, Rourke on the road, how much you trust Notre Dame's ability to run the ball with Love. And Daniel, your point about a low-scoring game, I think, is well taken. To me, I do like Notre Dame. I'm going to go ahead and give you my pick. I'm going to take Notre Dame in this game. I'm going to say, 27-17 Notre Dame. Again, I think it's pretty low-scoring. Yeah, I'll stick with it. I kind of think maybe that's too low. But I just think Notre Dame's defense, which is just ridiculously stacked, Kaiser, Watts, Osbury, all those guys, they're going to give Indiana fits. It is a level of athlete that Indiana has only really faced twice against Michigan and Ohio State. Neither time were they really able to score much at all. And I think this game is going to look really similar. If that's true, though, the question is, can Notre Dame score a lot? And what I want to see from either one of these teams is I want to see this game get into the 30s for whoever wins or for both teams. If they can do that, I have a lot of respect for these defenses, and I think that's a sign that whoever wins this game or whoever does get to that point is really good. If this is like a 17-13 low-scoring game, I think that is a bad sign because there are reasons to be concerned about both these offenses. I know the defenses are good, to your point, Daniel. But they're going to face other defenses that are really good, and they're going to face offenses that are capable of scoring more than 20 points against a good defense. So that's where I have this game, like 27-17. Where do you have it, and what's your thought?
I think Indiana's game against Ohio State was an opportunity for them to learn a lot. And I think Indiana wins this game. People think I'm a Notre Dame hater. I'm not. I actually think that they're a good team this year. I think this is not a great matchup for them. I think they would probably benefit a little bit from playing a team that scores a lot but doesn't play the best defense. Like I think they would probably give SMU fits. I think Indiana finds enough offense in this game to win. I have some concerns after the 35 that was given up to USC in the last game of the year. I have some concerns about that schedule in terms of like Notre Dame played some good defensive teams, but not a lot of teams that could stress you offensively at all.
Well, I mean, they've played. Let's be real. They've played two teams that can throw the football, like at all. They played A&M with Wegman, who got benched for good reason. Um, they played a Georgia Tech team that's kind of gimpy. Is probably the third best offense, but otherwise it's Louisville and USC. Those are the two teams far and away the best passing offenses they faced. They give up 24 and 35. And those are good defensive games, but it's not, world-shakingly good. So I mean, I'm just saying on paper this comment has.
Are you talking yourself out of your?
No, I
mean, are you talking yourself out of your score?
Maybe a little bit, but your point has merit, and this is why.
All right, so,
why I think there's a question here.
All right, I'm gonna go Indiana 24, Notre Dame 20. I'll give you an opportunity to give us a quick closeout, and then I'll wrap it up.
I think my closeout on this game really is that it's a shame that we didn't see more of what these teams were through the course of the season. I think it's also, to me, kind of interesting the way that the playoff rankings shook out, that they put Indiana all the way back at 8th with only one loss there with Boise, and Notre Dame at 5th. And I'll leave it at that. I don't know what you say about Indiana's schedule, losing only to Ohio State, to say that Notre Dame with a loss to Northern Illinois and their best win being either Texas A&M or USC is 3 spots better. I'll just leave it at that. And so it'll be interesting to see how this comes out, because I think I said before, Ohio State Tennessee is the most exciting matchup, and I think maybe the most dangerous teams in some ways in the brackets, or at least the most dangerous set for sure with Oregon in it. But this Notre Dame Indiana game sort of flies under the radar as a game that I think are two really good teams, but also two teams that we know the least about. And if you're Indiana, I think you have good reason to have a chip on your shoulder to say, why was Notre Dame given the benefit of the doubt and not Indiana? And to echo comments we did a whole playoff video and playoff rankings, which nobody watched that commented angrily, and people replied when we'd said, why, you clearly didn't watch the video, and they'd say, well, yeah, I didn't have time. The point of that was not Alabama in over SMU. I think there's plenty of reasons to leave Alabama out. My problem was SMU in over several of the teams behind them, like South Carolina, who has better wins, better losses, and actually beat Clemson. And the other problem I have, Daniel, is some things like Notre Dame over Indiana. And if you want to talk about brand names getting playoff slots, I think brand name got Notre Dame in over Indiana, and preseason ranking got Notre Dame in over Indiana in the rankings they're at, because I don't think there's good reason for Notre Dame to be the 5 and Indiana be the 8. But at least they're playing in the same game, so it's an academic discussion. People can be angry at it. It doesn't really matter. You're playing the same game. If you want to get the chip off your shoulder, go out and win. Make Daniel's dreams come true. And so it'll be interesting to see.
All right, y'all, let us know what you think about this game, and if we're right on, well, who's right, Josh or me, on who's going to win this game. And let us know what you think about the future of the team that wins this game and how they might fare with the rest of their bracket. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.